それでは大変お待たせいたしました。
Thank you very much for waiting. Let's begin the afternoon session. So let's start the round table. Discourse law and ethics after nuclear accidents. So Kajira-san, Shimizu-san will be a co-chair.
Thank you very much. Now I'd like to commence the roundtable discussion. We have 3 hours for this discussion. However, actually, we are already behind by 10 minutes. Therefore, I'd like to ask for your cooperation for smooth proceeding for the afternoon session. Now, how we are going to proceed this roundtable discussion? Because we have heard the very informative presentations from 6 speakers in the morning, and therefore, based on these presentations, as we serve as co-chairs, I'd like to present some issues and problems I want you to consider, and I believe this will be a good starting point for you to deepen your constellations. In addition to that, there are people coming from the affected area. They are the protagonists and main characters for this issue. Therefore, from time to time, I'd like to ask for their opinions. Those who have already occupied the podium, it may be all right. However, those who have yet to speak up, please introduce yourself briefly before talking about your remarks or questions, just for the sake of everyone attending here. Now, I'd like to propose the arguments or issues we need to discuss. I'd like to introduce those issues. They are really indicative. All of the morning sessions are really indicative and informative, and therefore I myself want to make many comments. However, because we don't have much time, therefore I'd like to limit myself to 3 points to present as the issues. The first point is the political consensus making or the engagement of the citizens. This is the first point I want you to consider as to the nuclear power plant, how we can get the consensus of the general public, or PA in short. There was the construction issue of the Sides Valley in the UK, and there was a public hearing held to discuss the construction of the Sides Valley NPP. For about 2 years, this public hearing had been kept at the university in the UK. I took a look at the related materials, and whole shelves in the library were occupied with the related documents because it took so long time for discussion. In addition to that, what's interesting in this deliberation is that in order to ensure fairness in discussions from the citizens' side, because they don't have enough knowledge in the special area, and therefore citizens have presented the proposal to have the guarantee of the money to hire the experts. Such a discussion was done. However, in Japan, speaking of the public hearing, there are only 2 days, once in each day, and everything is already done. Everything is just the choreographed beforehand, and this is totally different. Another example can be seen in Denmark. Before Chernobyl accident, as a nation, they had the deliberation to determine whether or not nuclear power generation was necessary or not. Back then, the government of Denmark put forth the policy of having nuclear power generation station. However, there was quite an opposition from the citizens, and therefore, by using sweet time, the pros and the cons arguments were prepared by the government to have the dialogues between the citizens and the government agencies. And then as a result, the Parliament of Denmark have determined not to go for nuclear power generation. So although the government wanted to have a nuclear power generation, however, through deliberation and discussions, they've determined to non-nuclear power generation. So this is a good example. And if we consider these examples, why Japan cannot take the same approach? There are many questions, I feel, and I believe you feel the same way, because in Japan, preliminarily speaking, logical discussion should be done, and now we have to have a calm down, level-headed discussion. However, there's a preoccupation that we cannot reach a consensus. However, in order to suppress the disguise this situation, just money payment is done, and this is really prominent in the area of nuclear power. The benefits and the risks, or the interests, monetary interests, as well as the attitude of the general public. Of course, I should not use the general public to generalize this trend. However, I believe these are the barriers for us to have sound discussion, and maybe this may not be unique to Japan, but maybe unique to the whole Asian region. Especially when I look at the US and European countries, I'd like you to share your views and opinions, how you see whether or not there are any differences between Japan and you, or between Asian nations and on one hand and the United States and European countries on the other. The second point I'd like to present as an issue is the return of evacuees. Dr. Shimizu mentioned that instead of the scientific rationality, social rationality should be prioritized more. It's true. I totally agree with Dr. Shimizu's the idea. However, then social rationality, when we apply this concept of social rationality, it's really practically difficult, and we have to be aware of that. For instance, cumulative dosimeter is what I use right now, as you see here, to gauge and measure the exposure level. And let me show the figure last year. In 3 months, 0.1 millisievert for 3 months, and you apply 4, and then 0.4 millisievert. And therefore, to me, the city of Fukushima is safe sufficiently because of my dosimeter reading. Even the Fukushima University has solicited the students to give the related education. However, even if the figure is 0.4 millisievert, it's not 0. It's true. 0.4 is 0.4, and therefore, because of the Fukushima Daiichi NPP causes unnecessary exposure, and for some people, it's not acceptable, and it's true, and it's inevitable. And such psychological worries and misgivings should be the subject of the legal protection, and if so, to what degree? This is a practical problem we have to deal with. We don't like what we don't like, and we feel worry for what we feel fully. Yes, it's true. For example, from the Tokyo area, there are people evacuated from Tokyo area to Kansai area, western part of Japan, and whether or not guarantee or compensation can be granted for those people. And maybe some of you mentioned that compensation can be limited only to Fukushima. However, the affected area goes beyond the Fukushima prefecture. In addition to that, even within the Fukushima prefecture, the damage severity is different from area to area. In addition to that, within the jurisdiction of the local municipalities, under their jurisdiction, the compensation can be granted only within that the local municipality. That's not good in the legal framework. And therefore, when we think about the social rationality, as well as the lawsuits, as well as the administrative actions, how we can apply this concept of social rationality to the practical matters, including administration, compensation, lawsuits, and so on and so forth. Another point I'd like to raise is the responsibility related to the accident. This is the third point I want you to consider. Who to assume the responsibility for this accident, and who is the culprit, and who is assuming the ultimate responsibility for the compensation. These three liabilities should be separated clearly, in my view. First of all, who to be asked accountability or responsibility. As to this first type of responsibility, needless to say, TEPCO and the government of Japan have to fulfill their responsibilities. However, maybe the the municipalities of the host committee should assume the responsibility. For example, the local associations and the local governments have to have a part of responsibility. And even extremely speaking, I believe part of the responsibility should be incurred by the community members. However, having said that, the government or the general public cannot be the culprit or those who commit this accident. For example, the power generation companies and the power generation companies associations, as well as the government of Japan, have to be the responsible parties to provide compensations. However, if compensation is provided by the TEPCO initially, but who will ultimately incur the cost of compensation? It's not necessarily TEPCO nor the government of Japan, because if the government is responsible, ultimately financial burden will be on the taxpayers, yes, us. And therefore, just like responsibilities of shareholders, how we can ask them to take the responsibilities, and how TEPCO can take the responsibility for their creditors. There are many other factors, and all of these factors make this issue very complicated. And therefore, it's not just about responsibilities of TEPCO nor the government of Japan. If you point your fingers only at these very explicit parties, it's not sufficient. And that's why I hope that this the round table discussion can give you the forum where you can deepen your understandings. And in that sense, this would be really helpful. That's all. Now, I'd like to present some issues. However, before that, as one of the co-chairs, I have a request to you. In the morning, there were lectures followed by question and answer session. The pace was relatively slow, and therefore, simultaneous interpreters could accurately precisely interpret your remarks and arguments. However, when it comes to roundtable discussion, you get too much excited and emotional, and sometimes your discourses are too much improvised. And although there are simultaneous interpretation, but sometimes it's difficult even for the professional interpreters to translate from one language to the other. In such a case, as one of the co-chairs, I have to warn you to slow down, and sorry for that in advance. Now, I'd like to talk about the extreme problems. That is a very abstract area and a very specific area. The first issues I'd like to raise in the abstract domain is the trust and the contract. The knowledge and the democratic control are one of the main topics we discussed in the morning. However, apart from that, there are something that only professionals or experts can do. Because of the nature of the system, as well as the nature or essence of the knowledge, there are something that only experts can deal with. However, at this moment of time, not only at the conceptual level, but even at the logical level, it exists. Suppose that the patient is brought into the doctors who are unconscious because of the traffic accident. Because the patient is unconscious, there cannot be any direct discussion. And if there is something that, as a doctor, if there are anything that I cannot provide any treatment to a doctor, then there is a contract, and there is a Hippocratic declaration. There is an absolute trust from the patient to the doctor should be necessary. However, legally, this is the prohibition of the individual contract under the civil code, and therefore sometimes the trust cannot be given legally speaking. So this really ultimate trust or the trust in the extreme situation can be established in many other occasions. For example, how the adult should behave in front of the newborn babies. And if I pick up the economic issues, suppose that the company and the representative of the company, of course, between these two parties, there must be the trust. For example, the legal entities under the United States legal framework, such a trust cannot be existed, and that's why the actual effective the individual contract is concluded between the representatives of a company and the company organization. At any rate, we have to consider the trust. On day one, Glenn Kazuma said that our body does not lie. I believe this trust issue will go back to this issue. Newborn baby, under the democratic engagement and participation, there's a people who have newly born, and there are the people who will born in the 30 years. However, because they will born from now on, they cannot take part in the current democratic participation, and therefore not only the participation by the experts and the government of Japan, but the trust should be considered solely for talking about the very abstract issue.
As Ishimura-san said earlier, so when we face the crisis, it's impossible logically to prove scientific rationality. So it's logically impossible. So what can we do with the scientific rationality? So it's better to explorate based on logical impossibility. And the same question goes to social rationality. So we've been talking about the nuclear accident. So we are trying to take care of the aftermath after the nuclear accident logically. So that's the question we have to ask ourselves. So of course, I'd like to solve those victims. But let me be more specific. So in the presentation in this morning, so we talk about ideals and democracy. In the second half of the presentation, we talk about the legal aspects. So we mostly talk about the legal framework as a specific examples. But there are other types of problems that the victims and sufferers have. So we have to have more wider support or relief to those people, including the scientific recognition. It's not just a relationship between the expert knowledge and civil knowledge. It's also related to individual human relationship. So it's related to consensus building, as Mr. Shimizu mentioned earlier. So when one has a specific problems, so I'd like to invite the questions from the actual local people with the specific problems. That's how I would like to start the session. So before we sing out someone, anyone who would like to say something on the volunteer basis from the people from the round table, any comments, any question, any comments? If not, then can I ask someone to make comment or questions? So Suzuki-san. So my name is Suzuki. I'm from Koriyama in the center of Fukushima. So that has 320 people, and I'm running a radio station there. I just opened the radio station. 100 days after the opening of the radio station, we had the accident or earthquake. So things were moving forward in an unexpected way. So when we talk about the radio station, it's for the local community. So I would like to see ourselves as a local city community-based media. So 50 local-based media, 50% other public media. So that's where we stand. As Shimizu-san said earlier, he talked about the public hearing in the example of the UK. More than 10 years ago, I was involved in civil movement and I attended a public hearing. There's a river called Osegawa in the city of Koriyama, and there was a flood. And they decided to improve the soil and build the bank for the river. So there was an old block, and there was a sakura trees along the river, and people in Koriyama loved to see those sakura trees. So people questioned what happened to those sakura trees, and the answer was, we'll cut them down. When they're discussing how to retain or maintain the trees without cutting them down, and that's how the public hearing was held. And I was involved in preserving the sakura trees. I attended the session, and at the public hearing, to build a new bank, some people have to offer the land. Well, there are other civil residents there, and they just talk about this issue. Well, there are some people that I don't know at the table, and I asked them who they are. They are the employees from the general construction company who are supposed to build the bank. And they were 50% of the attendees of that public hearing. So this is just the tip of the iceberg. But when one says this is a public hearing, well, I thought that we can't rely on what's been discussed at the public hearing in Japan. And this year, NUMO organized the nuclear waste issue discussion, and I also participated in the briefing session. It was just a one-sided presentation, so no opportunity for the citizens to ask questions. They won't accept any question that they can't answer, so that was obvious. So in a true sense, citizens' participation was difficult. That's how I felt. Going back to the previous point, without cutting down the sakura trees, there are a lot of signatures from the local residents, but those people didn't attend the public hearing. Well, even residents have an intention, a wish, but they won't express their wishes at the public meeting. So people just assume someone else will represent their ideas. So that was an atmosphere that I felt. So in a true sense, public dialogue is difficult. So the public participation or citizens' participation is something that's difficult to realize. That's how I felt. Well, I totally understand what you said. Well, let me just say this. Isn't there a problem on the participant side as well? Not just the organizers. So I was when we started the committee to do a prefectural health research. There's a ceremony that the committee make a sort of announcement to the attendees. Well, I think we shouldn't do that, asking, giving some instruction to the observers. Well, observers are activists, and those people, well, just organizers assume that attendees are the activists against the organizers. But there's a history behind this. When the prefectural committee started to give instructions to the observers so that they can ensure the smooth operation, well, there used to be an obstacle by the observers to the proceeding of the meeting before. So if residents can suggest how the meeting can be run in a more smooth and effective manner, well, rather than having the clear distinction between someone who is opposing the idea or agree to the idea, even before the meeting, so then we won't be able to find a common ground. It's just my comment. The co-chair has to organize the discussion, as Mr. Shimizu said. Well, initially, who defines the smooth proceeding of a meeting, who present the topics to discuss for the meeting, that wasn't discussed. Well, that's the issue. If he can, we have to go back to that such basics. Any comments from Aihara-san based on experience? My name is Aihara, a journalist from Fukushima. As for the Fukushima's health survey, well, I have done interviews from the beginning of the initiative. I have never seen obstacle by the observers to the proceedings after the meeting. Well, they're interested in asking questions to the committee members. So after the meeting, they went to cafe to have a discussion to deepen their understanding of what's going on. So I've seen improvement of the learning curve among citizens, and sometimes attended those study sessions. I learned a lot from citizens' study session after the public hearings. So in response to what Mr. Simmons said earlier at the beginning, so from the beginning, the prefecture gave instruction to the observers, and there's normally a press conference after the public hearing. One person can only ask one question. That's a limitation. And there's a time limitation as to how much time one can ask questions. So there's a change as to how observers, reporters can ask questions or interact. So people can't ask questions as they want. And the prefecture gave more information to the major media reporters. So as Mr. Kajiyama said, so the proceedings of the meeting has been done in a closed manner, and it's difficult to see how the meeting is running. Well, as a journalist, who has the decision-making right? Who is the key person for the meeting? So the structure itself for the meeting is difficult, as we don't know who will be responsible for the result of the meeting. Sometimes people without any authority have the final say for the meeting. So we have to find out who will be the final decision maker for the meeting, but it's difficult to know who will be responsible. So there are two sides of the meeting. So there's an official meeting versus a behind the door meeting. So that has created distrust among the general public in those types of public hearings. Or may I just make comments on that comments? Well, as I said at the outset, having a discussion will bring the fruitful results. Well, I find it difficult for Japan to do that. Unlike the US or Europe, well, I'm just interested to know how the meetings will run in Japan. This depends on the maturity of civil participation or the length of history of the civil participation. That may have something to do with the way the Japan's meetings are run or public hearings are done. Maybe I'm just overestimating the way I assume the meetings or the public hearings are done in the US and Europe. That's why I just wanted to ask that. Sorry, let me just say, let me say something. Well, I disagree with what I said. Well, as for what Mr. Shimizu said just now, he didn't say I. So in his comment, he didn't say I as a subject. So right now, so he talked about, he just made his own personal comment, but anyways, so it depends on the definition of Asia as opposed to US and Europe, but including that point. So as he generalized, well, any question from non-Japanese people, the Western people?
Maybe just to clarify what we mean with a public hearing. I think a public hearing is something from the past. It was typical for the 50s and the 60s and the 70s in Europe and in the US to organize public hearings. Public hearings are no conversations. There are especially no joint decision-making processes. A public hearing is typically something where some kind of authority, economic or political, tries to defend itself against critical questions from the audience, from the public. So that's not a conversation. So a public hearing can never result in some kind of decision-making that would be trusted by all participants. So my question would be to you, is it the experience you were talking about here, were these like public hearings, or was there really the intention to come to some kind of consensus on something?
むしろそうしますと今のメスケンさんのお話は文化というよりも
So you're referring to it's related to the accumulation of history or experience. Then Mr. Takashima, Shimura-san, any comments? So public hearing, well, this is where we can listen to the authorities. So on a certain topic, the administration can listen to the general public, not based on the assumption that we can come to a conclusion using a round table discussion. We can come to a conclusion. There are different things. Well, in the Japanese various systems, like environmental assessment, well, we have a lot of schemes and systems where we can listen to other people's opinions. Like if we build a new facility and we have to assess the environmental impact of that facility, then the company have to make a report on that environmental assessment. And based on that, we'd like to listen to other people for their feedback. That's just a listen to the opinions. But the problem with the Japanese civil participation, we are at that stage at the moment. And in some other situations where we are supposed to make a decision or come to a conclusion through the discussion, well, it's rare for us to see such opportunities. I just came up with one example. So there's a lawsuit in relation to air pollution. So cars on the road, we meet the pollution, and that was a topic in the lawsuit. And there was a settlement made out of this court in Osaka. One of the conditions for the settlement was the administration will discuss with the general public in that region. But that's one of the conditions. And the residents won't ask for the damages in this manner. So the Ministry of Land and Construction will have a discussion as part of the conditions for the settlement. So based on the discussion in Amagasaki or Kobe areas, that's between Osaka, so there's a highway, and they would like to bring the traffic to the harbor area, offering lower charges to drive the traffic. So they spent 10 years battling in the lawsuit, and they agreed to have this out of the court settlement, and that's how they came to the same table. That's one of the outcomes out of the court. So that indicates how difficult it is for Japan to have such a discussion table between the administration and also the general public. Well, let me just answer the question. One has said that's a public hearing. That's what I was talking about. So when one country establishes a nuclear power plant, and the first step is to have a public hearing, and the operator has to explain to the general public in the second round of hearing, and the local government who permits the construction of the facility will have a session to explain to the citizens. It wasn't that the citizens participated in the decision-making process, but in Japan, when the citizens wanted to make an objection, the only way they can do is take it to the court. So they have to take it to the court to cancel the permission to have the building of the nuclear power plant. What about? I would just know what's going on in the U.S. and Europe. So I assume that such a venue have more of the discussion type of meetings, discussion-based meetings. So I'm just wondering if there is a convincing conclusion or consensus coming out of such types of discussion sessions in the U.S. or Europe. Or maybe I might be misunderstood.
So now we are talking about the consensus building. However, you aptly pointed out at this moment of time, if you look at the administration of Japan, citizen is included for the consensus building. I don't think such a system is in place. For example, think about the system of public comment solicitation. This is designed to reflect voices of citizens. Yes, there is such an intention. However, actually, practically speaking, it's the revision of the labor law. Public comment is solicited And days or period, just 2 days for soliciting public comments, it's really ridiculous. It's a really empty system, I have to say. Therefore, including the administration and the government, as Mr. Shimizu pointed out at the very beginning, including the government, we have to think about the mechanism of consensus building, because system or mechanism itself does not exist in Japan. Then speaking of the system or mechanism, the mechanism for consensus building should be based on what? Right now, in the world, there are many discussions going on in Japan, but most disturbing to me is the assumptions or facts, including the systems, existing mechanisms, or criteria for evaluation, and there are objective facts we have to based on. It's very difficult to define the objective facts, however, on the hypothesis. If this is assumption is reasonable, then this is a variation, and if you take the hypothesis B, then the consensus or the result is this. So we can have this kind of pathway. This is how the court is constructed, first of all, and the lawsuit fact is confirmed, and based on the confirmed facts, evaluation is made legally. At least in the beginning, we have to identify the cause, and in order to do that, I believe some mechanism or system is necessary. However, not so many people have considered it. For example, when we have a discussion, especially including the legal framework, we discuss this situation. However, we have to give deliberation on the system. The Japanese society has taken a certain system as an pre-assumptions or preoccupations. However, whether such system is sound, and for example, in the medical situation, maybe there are some uncertainties. However, we also have to identify those uncertainties. And I believe that this can be the one of the method we can do. Keith-san, Cecile-san, they wanted to speak up, and therefore please speak up.
I could give an example of a successful process, one that took place in Finland, to do with the burial of high-level radioactive waste. The government of Finland took a decision in principle in 1985 that they would dispose of their own waste. They were sending it back to the Mayak plant in Russia, which was a terrible mess. So they made this decision that by the year 2000 they would have identified a site in the country to put the waste, and by 2012 they would be putting radioactive waste into that site. And the first thing they did was to kind of survey the country to find those areas where it was a suitable rock for storing the waste. And they identified 100 sites, and they invited communities in those sites to express an interest in having that facility. Actually, I think 4 did, and 2 of those already had a nuclear power station. So they investigated those 4 sites, talking with the communities. But this was at the initiative of the people that wanted to bury the waste. It wasn't a matter of the citizens wanting to talk. It was a matter of the organization wanting to do that. And they agreed on the site on the west coast of Finland, where there is already a nuclear reactor. So they maybe had a community that was rather receptive to the idea. But I think the interesting point was that never have more than 40% of the population as a whole approved of the idea of burying the waste in Finland. And yet there was enthusiasm from these 2 communities to have the waste facility there. So that was a successful process. I don't think Sizewell was quite that kind of process. I think Sizewell was more the inquiry to bring a new kind of reactor into the UK, rather than very much to do with the siting of it. I think they only ever considered siting it at Sizewell. So the process in Finland has been less successful with the new nuclear reactor, which has caused a split in the government. The Greens resigned from the government over the siting of a new reactor up in the north.
Let me share the general topic. Sorry for that. I hope my remark may answer to the question raised by Dr. Shimizu. In France, I don't want you to regard the French situation as very ideal. Don't take that way. Of course, I believe you have a strong association of France with democracy, partly due to its history. However, at this moment, relatively speaking, in order to create a good democratic nation, measures and actions alone are just beautiful. Facade is beautiful. For example, as he mentioned this yesterday already, but in France, in the surrounding area of the NPP, there is the CLI, the Community of Information Provision, Committee of the Information Provision, in which the citizens or community people can participate as proposed. However, as I mentioned yesterday, actually, conversely, as Dr. Meskins mentioned, there was no discussion, there was no issue of the compensation talked on the side of operator. They just brainwash and educate the community people by one-sidedly providing the information. And there's almost no examples where the trend was changed thanks to the opinions of the citizens. Another caution I'd like to give is that when we think about the citizens' participation, yes, it's necessary. However, in the past, it didn't work well. Anywhere we looked around, at least to me, there was no good example of good functioning citizens' participation. For example, large issues such as social issue or public population issue, there's a concept of empowerment. In the beginning of the 20th century, for instance, there were issues related to the feminism, or another, the civil issue of Black American and the United States. With the empowerment, or under the concept of empowerment, if we allow citizens to take part in these movements, all of the problems can be resolved. That is the concept. However, what we could do is only vent out our frustrations. That's all. And then, let me go back to friends as well as the social issue. The concept of empowerment has new budgets. And when we talk about the nuclear power issue, there are many people advocating empowerment or questioning the adequate level of empowerment. I don't want to occupy the stage, but I'd like to share another example. In December this year, there will be a huge symposium held in Paris, COP21. The purpose of this COP21 is the participation of the citizens. However, citizens understand by participating in the process, or they have to assume their part of responsibility. They understand it. Because this is a collective decision making, and therefore, if trouble happens, we expect you to assume your responsibility, but you expect us to assume our responsibility. Based on this assumption, citizens' engagement is encouraged, but we have to remember this. Thank you very much. Now I'd like to ask for the opinions from the audience on the floor. Ishimori-san, did you raise your hand? Yes. Thank you. And please wait for the microphone. Now I'd like to share the current status of Miyagi Prefecture. Right now in Miyagi Prefecture, the highest problem is what to do with the substances with more than 8,000 becquerel. We try to prevent people from coming for checking and inspection. And we are polarized whether we need to have a public hearing or not, or do we have to accept public hearing or not. We are just polarized because if we go to the public hearing, we are told that you listen to the explanation. We have given the full explanation, and we don't have the authority to refute it. That's why we cannot go to the public hearing. We do want to participate in the public hearing. However, if we do participate in the public hearing, we are criticized that now we don't have an ear to listen to the contents. That is the situation of Miyagi Prefecture, just for your information. Thank you very much. Now it's high time to move on to the next point from the first question of consensus building. But I saw Meskens raising your hand. Therefore, if you have the conclusion or summary or the future direction, if you have insights on this issue, I appreciate it.
I just wanted to follow up on what Keith was telling about Finland. I would say that we have now some 15 years of experience with research and policy of public participation in radioactive waste management. Radioactive waste governance, I would need to say then. Why did especially Europe take that initiative? Not because it thought it was needed, but they were forced to do. Because of the technocratic approaches that have been tried out in many countries, among them Belgium, in the 80s. In Belgium, in the 80s, the National Waste Agency listed 99 potential sites in the newspaper without announcing anything else before. So, which of course caused a huge protest. And they didn't even realize that they did something wrong. So that was the 80s. But I'm not saying that things has changed today, but because of the waste has to be put somewhere, they were like forced to step out and approach the public and ask for participation. But that is okay. That is the negative vision on these things. You can also see it in a positive way. It's a learning process. We have our democratic processes, our institutions, they're learning on how to do this. And this process of research has been useful. Keith mentions the case of Finland, which we in general could call a success story. But in the research, we have also pointed out that a number of difficult points that you will always have to include. For instance, there were big discussions in the European research projects on what is an affected community. How far does the affected community reach? Is it only the municipality, or should you also include the village next to it? But these are normal questions that need to be taken serious in a deliberation process. The issue of compensation, we know that the biggest problem with compensation is, and I'm not talking about post-accident situations, I'm giving the example of waste disposal. The biggest problem with compensation is that a new disposal site is a safe disposal site. So in principle, those people who would need to benefit from compensation for the risk or for the trouble are the generations to come, not the generation today. How do you extend compensation to the far future? These are questions that have never been treated before in democratic contexts. They are relevant, and the good thing is that they can be taken up. But of course, we still, as I said yesterday, we can think of new forms of democracy, but the problem is that they have to be introduced by those politicians who like to operate in the old forms of democracy. And they are very reluctant to really introduce new processes. And the reason is obvious, because every new participation process is the same as giving up some power for themselves. So the only participation process is something that they take serious themselves. And it exists, but it needs time. I can give you the example of Belgium, where a citizens' jury, in 3 months, in a very intensive process, studied the technical proposal for for high-level waste storage in Belgium, the proposed solution for high-level waste. And I was one of the experts they interviewed in the third weekend, in the third session when they come together. And I was really impressed by the level of technical detail of their questions. So the public can become experts in their own way in these matters. The public is not stupid. If we say that the public is stupid, then we are also talking to ourselves, because we are also members of the public in other contexts. So for instance, just one example, and then I stop. The citizen jury made a very, very principal, important change to the design of the waste disposal site. They made a plea for retrievability for 100 years after the closure of the site. The National Waste Agency did not want that, for obvious reasons. It's more complex, the design is more complex, but the citizens were able to really enforce that decision. So public participation is possible, and it can really make a difference also. But you have to take it serious from the political side.
ありがとうございます。清水先生、何か締めの言葉のような。
What about Mr. Shimizu to conclude this discussion as for the consensus building? So, in the example of Finland, well, last I went to Finland and I visited the island there. And I learned about how to proceed with the disposal siting when one area accepts the siting. So there's no system existing there that brings a benefit to the local area just because they received the siting. There was opposition, but after the decision was made, but the consensus was built. So there was no strong objection to that decision. And as for the Finland situation example, well, there's one thing we have to consider. So their country is based on solid rock. I take a look at the nuclear facility. So they're based on a very strong and solid rock. So that's why the consensus was built, because of the safety as the foundation of the nuclear facilities. If we try to have the same kind of consensus building in Japan, well, not just with the procedures, there's other reasons why we're having difficulty having consensus on the siting of the new nuclear facility. Well, anyways, I just would like to create a culture where people can understand each other through discussion. Well, I'm also part of the Fukushima Prefecture, hoping that we can have a common understanding between the citizens and the Fukushima Prefecture. Can I just introduce new idea? What you can, well, information sharing. In the case of Finland, there's a public jury. So there's a public organization to work as a jury. Well, as for the nuclear waste, there was a public organization works on the government to change their opinions. Or there are some organization who does research if the government doesn't do any research on the effect after the event. So the difference between Japan and Finland, how the government responds to the movements from the general public. Well, there is a structural or the system-wise scheme. Well, Mr. Mention said people are not stupid. And Mr. Shimizu said that we can understand if we talk, but even we have a scheme in place, but we have to consider scientific and social rationality. So before we come to a consensus, we have to think about how we can deal with the discussions. So the second topic raised by Mr. Shimiz, centering on the social rationality, continuing from yesterday's discussion, we have to look at the scientific findings. So let's discuss on that point. So to talk about the social rationality in terms of social psychology, let's look at the nuclear incident, Mr. Takahashi. And as a doctor, as they deal with the patients, they have a lot of questions. Mr. Taneichi, can we have some comments from you too? My name is Takahashi from Yamaguchi University. You see the white paper of the nuclear accident incident centering on the western part of Japan. There we have done a survey of the refugees or evacuated people. Well, it's related to what we have discussed already. Risk communication study or environmental study have been done by the utilities operators. So risk communication is so simple, and we can change the contents of the risk communication. As Cecile and I had a lunch with Cecile, and I had a son. Well, as we discussed over lunch, in France or in the US, there is no foundation. We didn't have a public discussion on this matter. But why is it possible for German to do that? So then, well, the decision isn't as ideal as it sounded. Maybe because of Eichmann. Because the people are accused of obedience. So the doctors and scientists or the government people have to make an excuse every time. They don't think they can just follow the orders. They are asked for their own opinions when they make a decision. Or in Japan or in France, based on the experience on Chernobyl, they have done the research on risk communication so that they can differentiate themselves. But in terms of academic perspective, it's a very small area, niche world. That's why the utilities operators have to sponsor such research. So I was talking about the social rationality. Well, people tend to forget the impact of such accident. In terms of sociology, people just want to forget about the sad things so that they can move on. And also victims accuse each other or criticize each other. Well, based on those existing findings, people start to feel tired if they have to continue on and on to discuss. And there's a mention of a German example. So Dr. Flugfile, would you talk about the process from the end of Eastern Europe, Eastern Germany, sorry. Unfortunately, I don't think I can talk about something optimistic or positive. In Germany, there's a high level of radioactive waste, and the question remains as to how to deal with such a highly contaminated waste. So in Germany, the companies who build the nuclear plants have to prepare the final disposable site that's been stipulated by law. So in Germany, we are breaking away from relying on the nuclear plants. We haven't finalized the location of the final disposable site. So for many years, we involved scientists to have had the extensive discussions, but I think the government made a wrong conclusion. So then again, we had to start discussion from scratch. So we have to start discussing where the disposable site should be. When we have a discussion on that matter with the public groups or environmental groups, they wanted to participate. And actually, they decided to participate in that, but they had a limited seat for those groups. So that limits the voices they have over this matter. If environmental lobby group, we have to ensure that those groups won't have any major power over the decision. That's how they decide the seating.
Sparen kann, wenn die atomare Endlagerung billig geregelt wird. Die werden alles tun, damit die Bevölkerung da keine wirkliche Stimme mit Gewicht bekommt.
The people who have the power, including the government, and those corporations who benefit from nuclear power, from their side, it will be more profitable if they could cheaply create a final disposal site. So therefore, in that case, makes it almost impossible for the citizens to be able to voice their opinion about this matter. They take various tactics in order to make that impossible. So we were talking about the topic of citizens' participation, which is very much ideal and very well. But the actual reality is very cold and hard, and this ideal and the discussion we are having seems to be very far from the reality.
Kernkraftwerke und auch die atomaren Aufsichtsbehörden in Deutschland versucht, den Abrissmüll so zu deklarieren, dass möglichst viel von dem Abrissmaterial auf ganz normalen Mülldeponien abgelegt werden kann. Also nicht als strahlendes Material, sondern einfach weg damit.
And in reality, in decommissioning nuclear power plant, we end up with a massive amount of waste. But they seem to claim that majority of such waste are non-contaminated, non-nuclear waste. That is actually what is happening, I believe. The nuclear power operators claiming that majority of the waste coming from decommissioning efforts are categorized as ordinary waste that are not contaminated. In decommissioning the nuclear power plant, are these waste high risk or not? The categorization is very much based on a criteria which is ambiguous, and this fact itself is risky and dangerous.
Wenn das so durchgeführt wird, dann muss man damit rechnen, dass im Kindergarten, auf dem Spielplatz, in den Straßen irgendwo sich Abrissmüll wiederfindet und keiner kann das mehr zurückholen.
Citizens' control of such situation in order to prevent such situation. Maybe there are such efforts, but in most cases, such situation is very much invisible. So what happens is that when there are construction of kindergartens and other facilities, other social infrastructures, it may be the case sometime in the future that the materials that came from a decommissioned power plant may be reused to construct even a kindergarten.
Bevölkerung dagegen, dass der hochradioaktive Müll in einem Salzbergwerk bei Gorleben eingelagert wird.
The final disposal site, one site was proposed called Gorleben. I believe many of you have heard of this name. This was a site in Europe which was a mine, a salt mine. They wanted to create a final disposal site on this spot, but it was faced with a strong objection of citizens.
Dieses Salzbergwerk hat Wassereinbrüche und wenn Wasser mit Salz sich vermischt, dann ist das eine chemisch sehr aggressive Brühe, die jeden Stahl in kürzester Zeit kaputt macht.
The issue is that it was a salt mine where salt is extracted, which means that there are underground groundwater coming in contact with salt, ending up generating a very strong element that could even impact the minerals. Creating the final disposal site at such area was considered to be extremely dangerous.
Zu diskutieren über diese Thematik, aber der Ministerpräsident hat entschieden, dort kommt der Müll rein.
Citizens very early on tried to study as much as possible about the risk in such situations, trying to voice their opinions of such risk and danger, but that prime minister at that time insisted on creating a disposal site there, as it has been a decision already taken. The reason why the salt mine was chosen was because it was closest site to the border with East Germany at that time. If anything happens, there will be damage and harm to the eastern part of Germany. And it was considered to be okay. Well, now today, we understand that there is a flow of stream, and indeed it was very risky geographical area. Regarding the new alternative for final disposal site, there has been discussions, But however, more recently, environmental groups who have been participating in this kind of discussion decided that it's meaningless to be part of such discussions. These environmental groups left the discussions. I'm sorry, we need to wrap up. Just one sentence, please.
もちろん問題の解決どうしたら
Of course, I have no answer as to the solution to this situation. The airplane has already departed. That airplane is called the nuclear power. The flight has departed, but there hasn't been decision taken on where it is landing. The airplane is just flying without any clear destination. Then a very scary scene. Social and society rationality. Let us talk about the airplane of our discussions going towards our destination of societal rationality. So let's go back to the original discussion, and Dr. Taneichi, please. Can you talk about your experience, please? Well, I myself, at the time of the accident in March 11th, I had 3 children, 4 years old, junior high and high school, and I exercised as a doctor in Fukushima. And after the accident, we have moved to Ishikawa Prefecture, and since then I have been active there. But however, that said, once a month I go back to Fukushima Prefecture in order to undertake screening. Well, I am a plastic surgeon, but because of the accident of March 11th, I started to undertake thyroid screening. Well, I had no choice. The reason why I started undertaking thyroid screening was because other doctors there were not willing to undertake thyroid screening privately, so I had to step in. Well, my opinion in being from Fukushima, I don't know if this perfectly matches the subject of the discussion, but anyway, as I said, I was a plastic surgeon in Fukushima, and faced with this March 11th, I had no idea that such massive contamination, radioactive contamination, could occur from the accident. I had no idea before the accident. So in a way, the secondary contamination as well is something that I was not ready about. So the emergency, the radiation protection team entered the Fukushima Prefecture right after the accident, so from Nagasaki University, and they came to Fukushima. They taught and gave instructions, and locally they started giving lectures about radiation. Well, at that time, normally a doctor is very prone to authority, especially if you are not expert in that specific field of medicine, then you tend to absorb everything in a very gullible manner. So as a result, what happens is that these doctors, go and tell the residents and ordinary citizens exactly what they have heard without modifying that. So because the local doctors who were not experts of radiation, who did not have enough knowledge and expertise, they repeated what they heard when they said that the new radiation is safe. Well, but the local people started studying on their own, increasing literacy level, and there were oppositions. But among the doctors, it was only the minority doctors who really faced the situation of risk. I was one of them who opened up my eyes in the situation. Now, at that time, did we have an accurate knowledge? Do we already have an accurate knowledge? That's there's a big question mark there. And because there was a lack of accurate knowledge, there was so much opposition from the residents and citizens. So how about the local doctors? they, compared to the well-studied and citizens, they knew less. So certain people rejected making opinions because they said that they didn't know enough. And as a result, what happened within Fukushima Prefecture was the lack of confidence, loss of confidence in the whole medical field. So that, I believe, is what has happened. Thank you very much. So having heard that, so the citizens knew better than experts. Despite that, experts were criticizing citizens that they lack rationality. That seems to be what happened in Fukushima. Chiba-san, what do you think about that? Because you're very active in Chiba and also Iwaki City in Fukushima. What do you think?
私は今現在
I myself, well, is involved in the soil sampling and radiation measurement in schools and other areas locally. We are a network of mothers. The reason why we started being active in this field is because no one else was doing such activity, so we had to step in. We wanted to know the reality of the level of contamination that surrounds our children, the actual measurement, not only air dose, but the soil radiation level. These data were what we assembled and what we submitted to the Board of Ed and also the other authorities. And based on such data, we are continuing our discussions and consultation. But what we feel in our discussion is that they really know nothing in terms of the reality. The actual measurement is undertaken by the subcontractors, outside company, even if it's the measurement that should be undertaken by the municipalities or the government or the local government. So the actual officials have no idea of what the reality of the measurements are, and they talk about and they claim that they think about the future of the children of Fukushima, but that's all they say, and the action is not followed. Several thousands of becquerel of contamination is surrounding various environment of children and infants who play in playgrounds. This is a condition that very much concerns us as mothers, and that is why I keep talking about this as a mother. But however, even the mothers, even the at least the mothers who have children, start understanding the situation, even if they are in the government side or local government side. What's really important is to bring the real measurement data to the discussion table, because without that, the other side would not understand. They keep claiming they take measures, they have policies, but actual measures and countermeasures do not exist. That's the reality.
So when it comes to the citizens' intervention, so when people see mothers, they're so concerned about the babies and children. So maybe they're just overreacting to the situation because they have children and babies. So there's some prejudice on the government side and local governments. And we show the actual data to talk to them. And I just communicated about the situation with the actual data. That's how we started to have a decent conversation gradually. And when there's a contamination, then they realize they have to take some actions on that. So they are trying to do for the better of the local people, even they have to violate some of the central government rules. So now we are starting to have a meaningful discussion. Then mothers have to really work really hard to collect the information to convince the local authorities. Well, I don't think that's a participatory type of discussion we have had.
I have been spending a lot of time in Fukushima Prefecture over the last 4.5 years. this time living with residents. And during this time, I have given perhaps 25 lectures or discussions with citizens groups about the impacts of the contamination on wildlife. And for all of these times, it's been at the invitation of local citizens groups rather than any government organizations. There does not seem to be any organized effort to communicate the science to the citizens. In fact, perhaps just the opposite. Thank you.
ありがとうございます。
Thank you very much. Well, we understand we have different experiences to share.
すみません。富山大学の林守と申します。
My name is Shimamura. So, scientific and societal rationality. So, in terms of the easy use of these such words, it is being criticized even among the scientific field. Beck wrote a book called Risky Society or Society of Risk, and this publication mentions very briefly about the so-called scientific rationality, and that there is a problem in making a decision purely based on scientific rationality. So therefore, we need to also take into consideration of the social rationality. That's all it says, however. But human beings are irrational. We tend to have certain rules or customs, or we are prone to various influences, listening to our superior or bosses, influenced by the conflict of interest. So even if we talk about scientific rationality, this may be just partial. This may be partially contaminated or influenced. And even in this morning's discussion, we talked about the rationality, but however, that rationality was scientific rationality from the perspective of the Ministry of Environment. I was talking about this discussion about the committee member from this morning's lecture. So what's really important is actually scientific knowledge and human rights and the sense of purpose about what we are doing, and who we are working for, and what is it for. So these need to be clarified first. If you try to clarify these elements, then we need to utilize occasionally scientific or social rationality in order to reflect upon ourselves and our mode of thinking. But we can't abuse this word of scientific or social rationality, saying that because it's rational, there is no room for objection. Thank you very much. Regarding scientific rationality, Dr. Matthews, having published your paper, you have received various comments on your paper within the scientific peers. So you had the peer review. So could you talk a bit more about the scientific rationality among the scientific peers?
We've had a lot of discussion about our paper. It was published in the BMJ in mid-2013, and it was the most highly cited paper for 2014. And I guess that says two things. It says, one, the work was in an important area, and it also says there were some very influential people in the radiation community who didn't want to believe what we'd found. There have been a number of criticisms published. We can answer all of those, so we don't think any of the criticisms are valid. And as you know, the substantive criticism of reverse causation, we don't think explains what we've found. There are a number of prospective cohorts of CT-exposed populations also being assembled, and apart from the UK study, ours is the only cohort study that's been published. While I've got the microphone, maybe I could just make some comments about the context that I've heard about in Japan. From the discussion this morning, I heard that in Japan, any challenge to government can happen at the local government level, but not easily with the national government. Perhaps someone can comment on that. We've also heard you can challenge a company through the legal system. And what I just want to say is, because of the complexity of the radiation area, as we just heard from Dr. Tanichi, it's been very difficult for people to get focused on the details when they haven't grown up in a radiation culture. And of course, the established radiation culture is, we think, too close to the nuclear industry, and it's got conflicts of interest. So, in the Japanese context now, what steps can be taken to engage with government in a way that will give a stronger response? I don't know the answer to that question, but in Australia, for example, if we had a similar controversy, we might have a Senate inquiry. And the thing about a Senate inquiry is we don't have a majority government in Australia that controls both the Senate and the lower house. So a Senate inquiry can explore complicated issues with the opposition having a stronger voice, because they can sometimes get almost equal numbers in a Senate committee. The other kind of response that Australia and the British system could adopt is what's called a Royal Commission, where a judge is appointed independently to get to the facts of a matter. And in the Australian or British system, that Royal Commission is independent of the executive government and can sometimes come up with findings that the government doesn't like. And I guess the other kind of process in Australia would be to challenge the government legislation in our High Court. But from what I understand, it would be very difficult to challenge the national government here. But I'm just asking the questions because as I'm new to this situation, but we've heard the difficulties when situations are polarised. One of the ways to break a deadlock is to try and push the situation up to a higher decision maker. And I don't know enough about the Japanese situation to know if that's possible, but I'm just asking the question. Thank you.
I think in terms of there's two aspects for the rationality, the scientific and the social. They have different domains. They may operate on the same overall subject, but they are relevant to different parts. And if you take the example, for example, of passenger aeroplanes, well, passengers have valid views about certain aspects of how aeroplanes are designed. But you wouldn't fly in an aeroplane, the engines of which had been designed and manufactured by a group of passengers. So you have to make a clear distinction where the expertise is required and what kind of expertise it is. So where, for example, the threshold, 100 millisievert threshold is concerned, the expertise for that, scientific expertise, lies with the epidemiologists, like Dr. Matthews. How it's interpreted and whether that risk is something that is worth accepting or not, if there is no threshold, then that is definitely the domain of the citizen and the social scientist and people like that. So I think there has to be a clear distinction. And I think that's got rather blurred, actually. Historically, I think if you go back to, in the UK at least, to the 70s and 80s, that scientific rationality ruled everything. Then there was a backlash that, well, actually you ought to involve the citizens, and that's absolutely correct. And then we lost sight of that division between the two, and it became possible to challenge the expertise of the epidemiologists without actually understanding the epidemiology.
So the discussions that suggested by Dr. Matthews seem to bring us back to the first theme that we started to discuss. In case of lawsuits, of course, you can appeal, but as you continue to appeal to a higher court, oftentimes the decisions are made against what the citizens want. And in terms of the legal procedures, is the only question, is there about whether there were flaws in the legal procedures? And if there is no legal procedures, then the court would not question about whether it is safe or not. That has been the situation in Japan before the Fukushima accident, but after the Fukushima accident, things have started to change slowly in Japan. For example, Fukui District Court had talked and cited that the constitution, saying that human rights mentioned in the Japanese constitution is superior and precedes the other decisions, for example, in terms of the legal procedures flows or not. So I don't know if this is social rationality or not, but in a way, in terms of the courts in Japan, things are slightly changing in Japan. And Kishi-san had a comment as well, but I'd like to allow some comments from the floor, from the especially on the theme of social or scientific rationality. The lady there, please. My name is Kondo. I teach environmental sociology in a university, and I have spent about 10 years in the United States. So in that sense, I would like to talk a little bit about my thoughts about social rationality, including the thoughts in the West. various panel members have commented that when you think about the social rationality, human rights, citizens' rights seem to be the center themes or should be the center themes. So in that sense, where citizens participate, for example, if once there is a proposal for constructing a new power plant, nuclear power plant, we perhaps need to create a system where citizens can participate. When we talk about the final disposal site, before there is an actual candidate site that is proposed by the administration, we need to create beforehand a system for citizens' participation. And in that sense, when it comes to human rights or citizens' rights, how should we think about that? Now, if you look at the current situation in Japan and compare it to what's happening around the world, there seems to be like their complete ignorance of human rights or citizens' rights. The experts in the experts committees, the governments, the authorities are not acknowledging the human rights and citizens' rights in Japan. The past few months, we have been having major discussions and the Japanese Parliament's debate on the securities law, and that is clear also sign of the ignorance or turning the blind eye on human rights and citizens' rights. Well, now the human rights and citizens' rights, how can we enroot this? How can we ground this into the Japanese society? Now, perhaps maybe we are lacking certain culture that is a prerequisite for such rights. Maybe that's a way of thinking about this, and it's hard to create such culture. But what can we do in a concrete terms? Well, one thing that concerns me very much is the following. Well, we're talking about various authorities, the local governments, the national governments, who submit various reports. The reports are signed by the person in charge. Oftentimes there is a blank line where there should be a name of the person who is eventually and finally, ultimately responsible of that report. So after 10 years, 20 years, no one knows who is responsible of the content of that particular report. So what's happening now in Fukushima is that when we look at the Fukushima's health survey, the Ministry of Environment is involved in the survey activities and the committee's meetings. But when it comes to who is actually and ultimately responsible, that is unclear. So therefore, the person who is ultimately responsible should always be clarified, even in various documentations and reports that are issued by the governments. And also the committee consigning and experts in committees, and in that sense, in Japan, citizens do not have the right to appoint experts of their choice, which is an important element. I believe that system need to be revised so that citizens actually can appoint these experts. Now, when it comes to experts, finally, when there are recommendations that are submitted by the experts, usually there is agreement whereby one representative of the environmental body is invited at the least, and one representative from the anti-nuclear group must be invited at the least. But even though they are invited, their opinions are not reflected. Their opinions are completely swallowed. And at the end of the day, the final conclusion of these group meetings is pro-nuclear. Let's look at other countries in the West. When there are experts that are representative of citizens, well, if they disagree, and if their opinions are not heard, then they can express their intents by, for example, resigning from such committee activities. And that kind of braveness, courage, I believe, is necessary for these representatives. When it comes to the recommendations, for example, recommendations issued in the United States, there is always a way in which each committee member who were involved in the report creation and documentation have the right to at least make a comment, their personal comment in the report. If they are object, they can always have the possibility of submitting a 1-page or 2-page opinion with their signature, and that is included as part of the recommendation document or report, and it's published as such, including the objections. So that is one way of protecting human rights. That is one way of considering about citizens' rights. And so in that sense, that is, in a way, a culture of respecting citizens and human rights. And that such culture should be nurtured in Japan. And that's perhaps one thing I can do. Thank you very much. Now, the person over there. My name is Segawa from Takagi School. Regarding social and scientific rationality, continuing with that discussions we have had so far, one opinion I'd like to add is the following. There was a mention about the fact that it's even difficult to reach in Europe or America. Well, now, environmental group, citizens groups participating in the discussion in the first place, at the least in the West. Well, that is not the case in Japan at all. So, suggestion, if it's the FMS, the Fukushima Medical Survey, especially when it comes to the screening and activities related to the children's health in Fukushima, well, why don't we allow these groups, especially those activist groups and citizens organizations that are active in the children's health arena, should be able to participate in that such discussion. That is something that is still lacking in Japan, and that is what's needed in Japan. So that should be the first step. That does not mean that with that we will be reaching a necessary rationality, but I think that's the first step.
I was asked to introduce myself, therefore let me introduce myself at the Takagi School at this issue of nuclear. Even before 311, we have worked on that because now we are the nuclear economy. In addition to that, now we are the medical cost the economy, and because CT scans in Japan account for 1/3 of the global orders. In addition to that, gastric cancers and the other cancer type screening are conducted, very unique to Japan because other countries have not done that. That's why a bomb survivors notebook was created as part of these efforts. Then ICRP recommendation is what I read, and when 311 happened, experts in Japan, actually there is the highest number of Japanese ICRP committee members. The number is 8, and therefore based on the ICRP recommendations should be followed with that question as I expected. However, as the graph of Venskens, I made a question because there's no threshold, meaning that the ICRP recommendation does not have a threshold, and based on this assumption, the radiation protection should be provided. No, there's no such protection. However, I believe that ICRP recommendations, including the no threshold, that's what Japan would take. And I expected it, and Meskensen challenged the initiative and leadership for that. However, among scientists, for the sake of global consensus, even within the bomb experiments, ICRP has existed, and there are many consensus has been made, and even back then, there's no threshold. This is a scientific consensus. That's why Dr. Tsuda mentioned over and over again such as Dr. Otsuru and Dr. Nagataki, these experts said that there was no threshold. However, if such an expert said it should be corrected because it's wrong. However, such a correction should not be made by Dr. Tsuda. It should be made by the ICRP Japanese committee members, because there are committee members in the ICRP, and some of the Japanese ICRP members should say that the Dr. Nagataki did not understand the no threshold approach. Therefore, we have to redress him. There was no such remark. And then another topic is that the chair of the NRA talking about scientific rationality. However, based on the rationality of the nuclear exposure, if he said that 20 millisievert was all right, meaning that Dr. Tanaka did not read the ICRP recommendations. However, think about it, that person assumes the head of the NRA, and therefore I can say that the citizens are cleverer and smarter, as someone mentioned. I totally agree with that. I didn't expect that, and I had more knowledge than the experts before 311. However, now I found that even experts did not read the ICRP recommendations at all, and I realized such a dire situation as the current situation of Japan. Now, previously you have talked about the practical methods such as the collecting signatures of plea, and then the problem of the consultation, a meeting of the environmental issues. Now we are now talking about the consultations. Therefore, I'd like to ask Dr. Musso, mushrooms, birds, and animals. There are wrong experts, or so-called wrong experts, and then in the process of deliberation, how experts' opinions are reflected in the deliberation process. If you happen to have experience of being involved in such process, can you please share your experiences?
I've learned a great deal about how expert consensuses are built in the last few years from watching reading the reports from the International Atomic Energy Agency, UNSCAR, and others, and also having served on government panels in the United States, the National Academy of Science panels, for instance. And so, of course, the challenge in building consensus among scientific experts is the collection of opinions that must be done, and there's opportunities to bias the view of this committee very easily by who is selected to participate on these panels. In the case of some of these intergovernmental panels like UNSCAR and Chernobyl Forum, they're often not selected by the committee chair, they're selected by the individual countries who propose the membership. And these are often people who come from select groups of either industry or regulatory bodies related to the industry. And this is often by necessity, since there is a great absence of expertise beyond those areas in the field of radiobiology, for instance. It's either medically oriented or related to the industry, the nuclear industry, or the military aspects of nuclear. And so there is not a large population of scientists who do not participate in one of those kinds of activities. And so the view is often biased by that history. And so these reports are often influenced by that cultural bias associated with the representation of these committees. And yes, I face it with every publication because, of course, there's a great deal of skepticism in those communities towards any kind of observed effect that lies below 100 millisieverts, for example. And so one has to work very, very hard to convince the broader scientific community when one sees unexpected results. And this has been a great challenge for us over the years. How do we solve that problem? Again, the question is really how do we address this information issue? And in one way that I've thought about over the years is that one needs to commission one's own groups of experts, as has been done here in this gathering, by bringing new independent interests together, and to commission from these individuals the sorts of information that is needed to be dispersed to citizens groups, for example. This isn't the problem. The difficulty is the one of resources. Where does one acquire the resources to support such ventures? Because most scientists, as I've said before, most scientists are like plumbers. They don't do the work unless you pay them. So there has to be the resources available to commission this kind of activity. Most people cannot afford to do it on a voluntary basis, at least not for very long. But that's how I would recommend we move forward.
ありがとうございます。どうしましょう。ちょっと交通整理で、今社会的合理性と科学的合理性の話。
And the Dr. Shimizu has pointed out the very important point in relationships with the Fukuichi District Court ruling in terms of the social rationality and the scientific rationality. Another point is that the human rights as well as the cultivation of the characters. And there are many topics I want you to talk about these three topics. And Dr. Shimizu, can you please proceed the discussion? Yes, I have a colleague, Dr. Watanabe, and I had an activity. I have activities for students, and as to the students, actually they are not so sensitive to the issue of nuclear. However, if they live in Fukushima, to learn the nuclear issues, especially the exposure, they have to concern about it because they are in such a situation or environment. In other words, as to the social rationality, day in and day out, they have an opportunity to think about it. They use the specific term of those who stayed, and I'm one of those who stayed. And students face with those who stayed, and they are put in the environment where they have to stay in the contaminated area. However, there are some problems that cannot be resolved scientifically, and the students have to think about how they can cope with that and how they resolve those issues. If you have opinions, the suggestions for that, I'd like to know it. Thank you very much. In my capacity, I specialize in a specific area at the Fukushima University. Another specialty is anatomy, meaning that as to the human body, if I take a look at the human body as my concern of interest, I don't know the definition of the scientific rationality, but let me talk about objectiveness and subjectiveness rather than using the scientific rationality in the area of art. Both of them have to be touched upon. That is assumption to practice good art. Suppose I'm going to draw the portrait of the individual. Yes, I draw that person. However, with the perspective of anatomy, musculoskeletal structure should be well understood. So as the anonymous person, I have to study the musculoskeletal structure of the human being. That is objectiveness. However, if I take a too much objective viewpoint, the human being can be the objet.
So then we are losing the individual aspect in depicting in drawing portraits. I always base myself in a subjective perspective when I work, and in that sense, and also in teaching at Fukushima University, I believe that there is a very important role of art from two senses. First of all, by the way, I feel very much that this symposium is very refreshing, a position of various different views and opinions, but I didn't know about CSRP and the symposium up until this year. Perhaps even if there were advertisements of CSRP and the symposium, maybe I was not really registering it, even if I were seeing. maybe even if I saw the brochure, I would have thought that this has nothing to do with me. What's important in design and the role of design is that we can interpret certain things, such as the CSRP conference, so that people feel like it involves them and it matters to them. That's the role of design and the art. Well, in Chelsea College and in another art school in the US and in looking at art schools in Japan, and in comparing these, I found something that was very interesting. There is a clear rule in the United States that the graduate of a particular school do not go back to that same school to teach because you need a different perspective. You need to go forward in art. Different genre is important. Of course, what you are focusing on as a current genre that you're focused on is important. But at the same time, as an artist, you need to also have certain objectivity of acknowledging other people's works. That's the basic rule for existing in the art world. Well, as we learn and as we exchange different opinion, we can go forward. But in a way, that's the only way we can go forward, by exchanging different opinion. I think that applies in arts and that applies in the expert world as well. I am from Yubari in Hokkaido, where there are mines. There has been mine accidents in the past, and I see very much similarities, and in that sense, very much anger of what is happening in Yubari in mines in the past and what is happening in Fukushima today. I think it's now time to take a short break. But now we are talking about social, scientific, rationality, opinions, different opinions. But certain things are basic similarities that cannot be explained and categorized as different opinions. That's human rights, for example. That's rights, people's rights. So the third theme that was proposed by Professor Shimizu was the following: the infringement of people's rights in a very concrete manner, and the issue of responsibility. Who has the responsibility? Where lies the responsibility? I think that's the subject that we would like to delve upon after the break. But right before the break, I would like to allow one more opinion. Well, I'd like to talk about OE. And previously, I was not so much involved in terms of the injunction against nuclear power plant constructions in the past, but I am involved in OE, and it has been appealed. Decision has been appealed in Kanagawa, and I have exchanged opinions with the group of lawyers who are defending the the plaintiff. Sorry, the claim for the plaintiff is zero risk, and if you talk about zero risks, cars, automobiles are dangerous. That was one comment that was given by an expert, and that was actually cited in a newspaper. Well, we did use the word "in case." However, accident like that, the March 11th should never happen. And what should be the role of the court in preventing such accidents in the future? The rights of peoples and residents in terms of their livelihood, health, and economic well-being has to be protected from Japanese legal perspective. And if there are situations that could happen in the future, then that needs to be prevented by the court. And that's why we use the word "in case." And another point I'd like to talk about is that at the appeals court, there has been a very difficult or complex discussion. The Nuclear Regulatory Authority has been newly created after the accident. The NISA, compared to NISA and the previous Nuclear Regulation Authority, the NSA has a higher authority after the accident. Based on that assumption, government. Well, certain politicians are claiming that the judges in the courts are no longer have the expertise and the knowledge and to make the proper decision making in terms of if the nuclear power plant is safe or not. So in that sense, they should only allow administrative lawsuits. Well, in case of Germany, that's the case as well. But that has been the new stance among the courts in Japan after the creation of NSA, the Nuclear Safety Authority, because they think that the judges in these courts are not experts in the nuclear power and radiation, so they are not in a place to make a proper judgment in this matter. And with such stance, it is impossible to enter into the discussion of the human rights. So that was just one element that I wanted to contribute in this discussion. Well, in reaction to that comment, the judges should not make such expert decisions was one comment among criticism that was made recently. But that is completely in opposition and conflict with the current legal system and the lawsuit system in Japan, because not only certain experts, but the entire society need to be involved in the rational decision in order to achieve the social rationality. So when you talk about that, then you have to talk about the social rationality and the relationship of experts with that. When expert group submits certain proposals, then they have the accountability, which means they need to explain the basis of their proposals. Experts decide. If everything is decided within the expert group, then you need a special court for each expert groups in each area of specialties, among doctors, among scientists, among engineers. And if that is the case, and if this is a new legal system, then it is impossible to get a general consensus among the citizens. And in that sense, if there is any claim that is made by the experts, then they are accountable to explain themselves. That is the minimum requirement and rules. So that is why this current criticism that the judges in ordinary court have no expertise and no authority to make decisions about the nuclear power plant issues. Well, going back to social and scientific rationality, very difficult to distinguish, I believe. You say, this water is poisonous, this water is not poisonous, this is potable. Well, and if you say that this poisonous water could be a medicine but could also be a poison, but then biologically our instinct as an animal is to minimize the risk. As mothers, they would say, well, if there is any risk whatsoever, then we would avoid that and we would take the safe water. So we need to take into consideration the human instincts, the animal instincts. Maybe this is different from my opinion is slightly different from Dr. Muso's, for example. But in any case, I believe the natural instinct of people there in Fukushima is that we would rather not to drink water that is contaminated or poisonous. Just one perspective. Thank you. We would like to close the discussion here and take a short break.